And now we are inviting Peter Fink, our favorite expert on the urbanism, an architect and laureate and an expert council member of the Flower Jam.
What I want to look at is a very different dimension of light. I'm interested how light interacts with people's emotions, how it creates a social impact, but also I'm interested in environmental impact of lighting. And as you might know, my practice ranges from large-scale earthworks, landscape design, large-scale public artworks, work in light, bridges, and so on. So I'm not a person who's very easy to categorize, and I will just show you some of the works in light, which is about 10% of what I do. This is a project which was interesting because when Canary Wharf was built in London, it was the first skyscraper in Europe of any significant heights, and people were really disturbed by the fact that the building is so tall. So the developers started talking to us, and I said, we need to make it small. And they said, you can't make it small. And I said, yes, you can. Because if you put 6-kilometer long lights on the top, and if you put lasers in it, which will go for 40 kilometers, the building will become very small. And they said, you can't do that. And I said, yes, you can. So I spoke to all the London airports, I spoke to the Ministry of Defense, I spoke to the intelligence services, I spoke to the emergency services, and I proved to all of them that it won't disturb the aircraft traffic and everything else. And people started saying, yes, 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 perhaps we can do it. But we said, okay, it's no good just putting the lights on top. It needs to also do something emotional. So I said, apart from animating the lights, so when the planes left Paris, within 5 minutes, the people could see Canary Wharf with this flower of light. It was only on for 2 weeks. That's the important thing. It's not a permanent thing. I also said at New Year, the building will count down New Year. The whole thing was animated on the last seconds and everything went, and suddenly millions of people in London were shouting with the building, and suddenly it became their building emotionally. What we also did, we animated the windows, and on every night, a different radio station in London played music, and the building was busking like a big disco for London. And what happened was amazing, because people drove from all over London, came, and they had parties everywhere with their radios and so on, and it created this enormous social impact. It was in 1990, what happened is that was that crazy moment in Russia when they had this first huge New Year's party on the Red Square, I think with Pink Floyd. And on all the newspapers in the world, there were 2 photographs, Canary Wharf and Red Square. The developers were amazed because they got something like $200 million worth of free publicity all over the world, and Londoners started loving Canary Wharf. So it was quite interesting. I was invited to go to America. They built this first residential hotel at the end of Hollywood, and they wanted me to somehow make it stand out from all the other hotels. And I discovered through research that that was a place where they invented color television. So I took the idea of the test card of the television, to drive the lighting of the building. And something really funny happened, and you couldn't script it even if you wanted to. Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was the governor of California then, was at a party with the owner of the Marriott hotels, and he said, we got this English guy who's doing something really strange with our building. And Arnold said, okay, when I go from the party, I will go and see. And because they didn't want anyone to see it, so I was programming it at 2 o'clock in the morning in a deck chair, in a place full of drug dealers and prostitutes and everything. So the policeman thought I'm a new drug dealer or something, because I look like it. So they came with all the cars ready to investigate, and at that moment, this huge Humvee car comes, and Arnold Schwarzenegger gets out and says, hello, Peter. He thought that the policemen are there to protect him, so his secretary phoned. The policeman looked and they stopped. And he shook my hand and we talked and he left. And the policeman looked at me and said, you know Arnold? I never met the guy. I said, yes, of course. They said, wow. So every night, I had 3 police cars there bringing me coffee and donuts every now, and it was all fun. You couldn't script it even if you tried. This is another project, the first project done with color lighting by kinetics using LED lighting. And it's done in Edinburgh, which is a city which has got very, very strict conservation policies about lighting. So when I said I want to use color lighting, they said, absolutely no way, because it's a historically sensitive town. But I said, no, 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 I want to do it in a way which you can't see on the panorama of the city, and I want to do it atmospheric, and I want to do it as northern lights, and I want to do it underside of the building, built by a very well-known Scottish architect, Murphy, and we built something where the city suddenly had a very interesting, vibrant lighting, but it didn't affect the panorama of the city at all. The Edinburgh Castle is just on the right. And we also use lighting in the pavement, so it was like people standing on light and looking on light, but not seeing light from any distance. I also started working with color light on historical buildings. This is a scheme of a town hall in a northern city. And I was interested in how you could use color light to do different things, but also to do a respectful lighting for every day, which highlights the more historical features of the building, but how that could change into something very different. Because I think one of the big aspects of modern life today is that people want to be different people. They don't want to be the same person. When they in work, they're one person. When they're playing, they're another person. When they're anonymous in some crazy place, they want to be free to be someone else, and so on. So I think the physical environment of cities, apart from the static architecture, should also have the capacity to reflect the different personas of things like buildings. So this scheme can go from the respectful to wild, and that's exactly what we want ourselves. We want to be respectful, but we also want to be wild, and we want to still be the same person. This is a scheme I was developing for Boston. They created this very boring park at a huge cost. They buried the underground, they buried all the roads underground, and they created this big green corridor. And it's a total nightmare in nighttime because no one wants to go there. There's very little crossings and so on. So I thought, let's create a couple of lighting points in the building. There were these very empty pergolas built by, I think, Catherine Gustafsson. And we thought, let's do something with it. So the one pergola, the idea was to have very thin carbon fiber rods, which would be mirror coated. So in the day you wouldn't see them, and in the night they would have fiber optics and they would sway, but they would not mimic nature. They would be man-made, something that created a sort of gentle sway animated by winds, moving naturally but not mimicking nature. The other pergola, I decided to use a much more organic approach to lighting, again the same way of swaying. And it was a point where people could come, and as they entered the space, they would animate a sound response which would be taken from a microphone located in the Boston Bay. So you would start hearing the ocean and so on. And as you would walk a little bit, the microphone would be located in downtown Boston, and you would start hearing the sounds of the city. And when you walked further down, the microphone was located in a bird reserve and zoo close to Boston, so you would hear the noises of animals. This is Piccadilly Garden. And the interesting thing about it is that I, being a part of the team, had very strong objections to the design. And I was said, no, Peter, you're wrong. They brought Tadeo Ando as a designer who designed the pavilion, and everyone was saying, it's Tadeo Ando. Please, please, Peter, stop. And I said, no, it's really wrong. Because you cannot put this bunker separation. People will really have a very negative reaction to it, and it will create a separation. And I also said to them, you cannot have this sterile big lawn and everything else. Anyway, they thought it was Ido. At that point, they thought they were the masters of the landscape universe. They thought Tadeo Ando is the biggest architect on the planet who designed this thing without even coming to Manchester, and it got built. I tried to find a way of softening and humanizing this project, which I thought was anti-humanistic in its public realm approach and architecture, by creating islands of light. And I was trying to get them to put trees on the lawn and everything. I didn't succeed, but we at least succeeded in trying to create something which minimized the effect of this huge wall in the night. So it became like a wall of light that people went through, and in the night people really started responding to it much better than in daytime, precisely because it got this sort of slightly magic quality of walking through a wall of light. And we also try to soften the effect of the park by downlighting benches and creating little islands of light, but also creating areas of natural darkness in the park. So the strategy was to create very defined circulation spines, defined fountain, but leave everything else dark. So people could cuddle and kiss and talk and so on. And in the nighttime, the Piccadilly Garden worked 100 times better than in daytime, precisely because it became atmospheric, but it also became more reflective of how people behave. This is a project, again, when I was asked to come and do something with quite a sterile public realm design of a square at a very important big regeneration project in Wales. And I thought, okay, it's so sterile. So it could be anywhere on the planet. Let's do something which will make it different. So I use the sterile geometry of the place and inserted lighting, which was in the floor. But the lighting was more than lighting. It has got movement sensors at every corner, and it has got the artificial intelligence algorithm, which takes information from the sensors about people moving, and it predicts what will people do next. So when, for example, they stop, it suddenly creates a room of light around them. When they move, when they stand and look at it, the whole thing shimmers and moves and flows like small rivulets of water. And when they start walking in it, like this person, it suddenly predicts where they might want to walk, and suddenly it illuminates their possible journey, or it illuminates the journey they walked. So it's like a snail trail of light. And that suddenly creates this incredible playground, and people come there just to experience the fact that they can react and affect behaviorally the light. And the children have got a very different approach to it to parents. And what is also very interesting is that people who cross it and don't know that, they suddenly realize that there's something happening, and they stop, and they start working out if it's them or if it's something else. And once they stop, they might decide to go to have a beer in the bar, and they might phone a friend to say, come and have a beer, and so on. And the economic activity of this bar increased 5,000%. This is a project I'm working on now in San Diego, and I'm in charge of developing the lighting vision for landscape, the buildings, and everything else. It's a $2.7 billion project. And the important thing there is, again, to understand what the fourth dimension of lighting in relationship to city building and architecture could be. So I started thinking, and that's something I do at the beginning, is to try to think about what the natural balance between light and darkness in these spaces needs to be. So for example, at a point which is ecological and has got a relationship to the bay, you need to have areas which are dark, because it's important for cities and birds and other aspects of human health to experience darkness. When you go into the middle of the commercial hub of it, it needs to be a lively 24-hour city, nighttime economy, and so on. And as you go onto the fringes and continue around the bay, you need to start graduating that town urban lighting into, again, darkness. And you need to understand how you can do all these things and minimize nighttime pollution. And you will see in some other projects how also the color temperature is important, and why of the lighting sources and so on. This also shows what I do believe economically, that today consumers, they do not buy products, but they buy experiences, and they are looking for a complete sensory encounter, ones that are personal and memorable. The question is, for example, in Moscow, if the trees from stainless steel and a lot of lights are memorable. I don't think so. What I also think is to understand the hierarchy you apply to these things. Because it's very important to understand not only in terms of how much money you will spend on things from the budget you've got, but also to get a psychological hierarchy of lighting, as, for example, was shown in the project with the church. If you got a Norman church in a fishing village, that is the only landmark. Not that it's the only landmark, but psychologically, it's what the city is focused on in relationship to landscape and the sea, and this is a human landmark that the humans brought into the history of that whole landscape. So it's very important that you understand in every project this psychological and landscape hierarchy and urban hierarchy before you really start thinking about lighting. It's also very important that you understand which are the public realm spaces, i.e. a lot of people, which are the gateway signature spaces, which are the scenic relaxing spaces, because sometimes people do need darkness and a very different emotional interactive space. So it's a project which will take me years to detail, but these are quick sketches. You also need to understand how that also relates to the main functions of the spaces and so on. This is another project doing in the same city. It's a 7-block development. And again, I was brought in to say what you could do with lighting. And here I was very interested in day lighting and nighttime lighting. Because if you look at cathedrals, churches, one of the things they understood is that if you put gold gilding on the ribs of the dome, it will reflect sunlight and the whole religious building will glow in daytime. So I thought it would be very interesting, because the developer is doing 7 these huge buildings, is to use the same approach, to have a golden anodized mesh, not from gold, to reflect daylight, and in the night to turn it into an interactive theater of light of the 7 blocks. I also started thinking how you can bring it to the level of the pedestrians, and I'm working on a very big gateway artwork, which is about 45 meters high, and taking the lighting through the development, and at the ocean edge, having an interactive wave of light which runs through the whole development and culminates in this large artwork, which also will be a screen for projections and drawing the people into the development, because all the cruise ships in San Diego come to here, and it will become the gateway into the whole of downtown and so on. The last project I want to show you is the one that I'm working on now for 12 years. It's a $20 million lighting project, and we are now doing tests. We're also doing enormous environmental studies. That's why it's taking 10 years to show that you can light a 4-kilometer long bridge in the way I want and not having impact on migrating birds, spawning fish, eelgrass in the bay, airports. Behind this, it's the home of the Pacific American Naval Fleet. So we won't create light which will make the warship to hit the bridge and things like that. And we're also working with Philips and using the most advanced LED lighting that is on the planet. And what are the issues? Which is quite interesting. I don't know if you know, but your eyes have got two optical nerves. One is going to your brain. That's the one which allows the brain to construct what you see. And because the eye has got so much information coming into it, your eye is shutting down thousands times a second, and your brain is just constructing this 3D world around you. So for example, when people lose their sight and regain their sight, for a couple of weeks they can't make sense of anything because their brain needs to learn how to make an experience of the world based on the previous experience of experiencing it. But there's another nerve which, for strange reasons, with all the medical science and anatomy, was never given much attention. And it goes to a very little gland, which is here. Some people think that this is the origin of the third eye idea. And when you look at it in anatomy, it's a little gland, it's like a little bean, and it's absolutely iridescent, which is amazing. And the doctor sort of thought this has got no function at all, because no one could see what the function of this little gland is. And what it is, it's a gland which controls the production of dopamine and other hormones. And how this gland does it is that it reacts to the energy of light from the sun. It doesn't react to darkness and light. It senses the energy that's coming from the sun, even in nighttime and daytime, so it doesn't really react only to dark and light. So you can go into a dark room in daytime, and the gland is still responding to the energy that's coming because of the orientation of our planet and the place you are at that moment on the sun. And it produces a hormones which are to do with you being alive and energetic in daytime and recuperative during sleep. And one of the things which is about lighting and pollution, and mainly with LED lighting now, is that the energy of light which goes into the higher Kelvin temperatures, over 4,000 Kelvin, that means into the blue spectrum, has got an incredibly disruptive effect because the gland is reading it, and it disrupts sleep. And this is what I think is being experienced in all modern cities, which are changing street lighting to LED lighting, that there's an epidemic of people not sleeping properly. And the reason why it's serious when people don't sleep properly is that one of the main functions of the sleep is that when the hormones flood the liquid around your brain, which people thought is there only to protect the brain from impact, it's there for another reason as well. It opens the neural synaptic connections on the surface of your brain. And toxins are discharged from your brain in that period. So when you don't sleep properly, your brain is not discharging those toxins, and people are tired, nervous, stressed, anxious, and so on. And LED lighting of higher temperatures produces enormous amount of the blue spectrum lighting, and not surprisingly, you got this huge epidemic of bad sleeping. Just to come back to the bridge, we developed a concept where the navigational piers, which are the piers that all the aircraft carriers and everything else goes through, are treated as static lighting, and the two sides of the bridge are the theater of light. One side goes into a very ecologically sensitive area of the bay, where all the invertebrates and the birds nest and all that sort of thing. So that will be treated with lighting that starts diminishing in intensity and function. And the whole thing will be responsive to the environmental constraints. And for example, in moments of high bird migration, the bridge will be almost dark. And I think it's very important that if you do these big artworks in light or whatever, that somehow they don't become just a part of people's internal furniture, but they are somehow constantly speaking to you, and you never take it for granted because you understand that they respond to a lot of other things and so on. This is a test we recently did on the two pillars to determine the color rendering qualities and everything else. And I just want to end up with a project I was sort of little associated with last year, which I found very to my liking, that it used lighting in landscape emotionally. And it's a project done by Katya Boganova and the lighting by Mikhail Markin. And what I liked about it is that it used lighting as an emotional statement. Because I think what I like about her gardens is that they always got a clear emotional narrative. And this central social space, which was transparent in daytime so daylight could go through it, so it was working with light, as I did in the San Diego project with the golden crowns of the building, created a sort of space of transparent light. And in nighttime, it did something outward, so it drawn people into that cocoon of that red light. And I thought that's a sort of emotional use of light in landscape I like. And I think clearly what was in the previous lecture is very important, because you need to work with nature, you need to work with darkness, light, and so on. But I do think that there should also be a space in landscape design where you can do something emotional. You can't do it everywhere. You need to find your opportunity carefully, but I really like that opportunity. Thank you.
Много всего сразу, да?
Thank you very much. Questions, please? I believe you need time to digest. So people need time to digest before they're ready with questions. Okay, we have one. You're welcome.
Thank you. That was very, very interesting. I'm a big fan of lighting, but I have a question about what we heard a lot about yesterday about sustainability and Greta Thunberg, and you showed a picture in San Diego, one of your potential projects or future projects, where you had daytime lighting, and I'm wondering. Okay, but it's a bigger question than that. So my main question is, to what extent, I know you're using LEDs, but to what extent does the energy usage impact on your design ideas?
Enormously, because I think lighting, as everything, is driven by two things. One is the value which cannot be quantified in money, and the other is to do with money and sustainability and so on. The first thing is that I think it's important to use lighting in a way which creates distinct places. So it's another layer of placemaking, because nighttime economy and nighttime experience is important. So you need to understand what it is. If it is a place where you are doing lighting like of a villa where people live, and you only want to create a scenic nighttime quality and a sense of slightly better safety or something like that, the lighting is very low and respectful and so on. If you are at a social and economic hub of a city, which will draw hundreds of thousands of people into that environment, you got a different challenge. And to give one example is, for example, the design of car parks. Forget about the justification of cars, if you use cars or public transport and so on. You got nighttime car parks, and the predominant thought was that the more you light them, the safer they become. Because what happened is that you had series of unwanted sexual advances against men and women in car parks. So they thought more light, more CCTV. But what people didn't realize is that if you overlight a space, and that can be a public park, public square, or a car park, a very interesting thing happens. When you walk through that space and it's overlit, everyone's face becomes flat, which means that you can't read the mental state of the person you're approaching. So if someone is in a psychotic moment, he looks as normal as a person who's not, because his face is overlit and flat. So more lighting makes actually these spaces more dangerous. So if you look at it in the social sustainability, there's ways of using lighting to address that. If you look at it environmentally, it's interesting, because I would never justify the cost of lighting a bridge for $20 million. It's a huge amount of money. But if you look at it as a moment which projects the ambitions of that city to have the best world-class waterfront that people will identify through that lit bridge, as they do identify Paris with a lit Eiffel Tower. You only need one Eiffel Tower. And if you create that strong emotional recognition, the economic and social returns are enormous, but you cannot do it everywhere. And this is, I think, the problem today is that you can have carefully thought out projects like the San Diego Bridge, and other people will replicate it in a very mindless way. They will say, we can also afford one, let's have one. And this is also what bedevils landscape architecture in Russia is, that a lot of the rich clients will bring photographs from magazines to designers and say, we want one of those. And this is the danger which comes to environmental issues and everything else, because once you stop being thoughtful about it, all these environmental issues and everything else come into the thing in force, and there's no strategy or thought to deal with it. So it's a complex issue, but an interesting balance.
Отпускаем Питера.
I believe we should let Peter go.
In the San Diego Bridge, is there a narrative behind the use of color?
Yes, there is, yeah.
It would have been interesting to know.
I am sick and tired of people coming up with these narratives of saying the lighting of the bridge responds to tide, it responds to temperature of water, it responds to XY kissing or I don't know what. It's crazy because you get all these narratives in these lightings, but no one can understand it because the data and the manifestation are totally disconnected. With the San Diego Bridge, I want the color to be directly affecting people emotionally. So it's about emotional response. And it's also about making the structure emotionally manifest its beauty in terms of the urban setting, because the engineers spend a lot of time thinking about the location of the bridge and the curvature and everything else. And I think there's very few things in our cities which have got that capacity. I'm, for example, working on a project in China now. I was phoned a couple of months ago by this very excited person saying, we will do it. And I said, what do you mean we will do it? Don't you remember when you were in China, you told us this idea? And I was saying, could you please tell me more? Because I got absolutely no idea what you're talking about. I said, you know, you were involved with this idea of the new Silicon Valley project for China. Now it's A-class project and it will be done. And you know we're planning to build 15 skyscrapers. And you came up with the idea that instead of lighting them in the night, it would be nice if the skyscrapers got only lit at sunrise and sunset and responded emotionally to the end of the day and the arrival of the night and the end of the night and the arrival of the night, and stay lit only at special moments, and to create this link to the end users rather than only making the architecture even a bigger penis in the night that it's in the day, right? And they said we really got excited about it because we think it's a very interesting way the skyscrapers could start working with sky, something that Alessandro was talking about, and that they become more a landscape contribution rather than a contribution about the architecture. And we like the fact that it would be an amazing event where people would anticipate the transition from sunset into night through the prism of the buildings and so on. And I thought it could be, it's fun. And those are sort of things which I'm finding increasingly exciting.
One question. 2 days ago, I show for a few seconds our garden in Kuwait. In the middle there's a mirror fountain, and we asked to keep the mirror fountain as it is, but the emir that like the space more fancy, more. They ask for a dancing fountain, many different type of lights, and now there's many light show also inside, no? But we asked to have these things, but also a white light and nothing inside. This is because and this is the question. I'm just scared about the place that I like it when there's the light, the dancing fountain, but I'm just a little bit scared about the place that asks me to interact all the time. You know, for example, some part of cities that ask you interact all the time probably are beautiful places in some moments, but ask a performance also to yourself to interact with the urban space. What do you think about this?
For example, if you look at Moscow, it's very interesting because there is one or couple of buildings. There is a building which is a modern eighth sister. It's like a sort of strange hybrid between Stalin's Seven Sisters and modern office block. And it has got the most aggressive, awful bit of lighting. There are these lines of lighting which start arbitrarily at a certain point and finish at the top, and they are pulsing this way, that way, and so on. And you just look at it and you just say, do I want to live in a city like this, which somehow doesn't see that this has got an effect on everyone in the city? Because it's a sort of lighting you cannot not see. There are certain things which you got the freedom to see or not see. This you cannot not see because it's in your face all the time. It's like light music in someone else's flat next door. If once it gets into your head, you can't switch it off. So I think that's why I was showing that other project is that when you do lighting of parts of cities or even a garden, it's exactly the same. You need to psychologically analyze your responses. You need to analyze all kinds of things like the long view, the short view, the history of the place, the progression, the patterns of usage and everything else and so on. And once you do all of this thinking, you start ending up with certain decisions which are cumulative but also focused. So you will take the decision of lighting a certain tree and not another tree and not uplighting it or cross-lighting it because you want the textures and so on. And it's like composing music. You suddenly realize that the composition needs to have a strong, creative human idea, and after you need to ensure that there's no discordances and that the whole thing has got a cohesion that you expect from an art work piece of music, which you won't find in cheap pop song or something like that. And so you need to do all this thinking before you even start designing. And I think that's perhaps both contents of what we were saying, is that the thinking before is almost more important than the thinking how to do it. And when you know how to do it, you still need to go back to the thinking before, and you need to adjust it to test through your eyes and experience if you really achieved what you thought before, and invariably you must do some adjustments because you cannot get it right without seeing it and testing it. That's why the San Diego Bridge is taking 10 years, because it just is taking an enormous amount of environmental and creative and tests of lighting fittings and lenses and all kinds of things. Because you need to have a lot of real experience to start taking judgments which most probably will deliver what you were thinking of before you started doing it. And I think this is a problem with today's world, is because people will get so much fee, and they will say, the client is paying us 100,000 rubles or something, so we can only spend 10 hours or 20 hours or whatever it is. And whatever we do in those 20 days, that's it, because we got no more money to think about it. And that's why a lot of projects are never refined, because people say, okay, we spend the money, we go for fees, we are doing something else because we need to pay for the office, we need to pay for the people who work for us and also so on. So no one has got the time to really go back and refine things and go back to it even after a year or two to see if it works, because and we need to change that way of thinking and working.
Последний вопрос.
Okay, and now the final question. Do you think the government should have a word in the light environment of the city, or should it be the realm of designers? Say in Moscow, as you have mentioned, we have quite a lot of overlighted areas that are too bright and they are shining in our face, in our windows. Thank you.
It's a difficult one because I am getting increasingly a bit worried about awards and diplomas and so on, is because I think people are beginning to collect paper. They are collecting all these bits of paper to put on their wall. But actually, these bits of paper are not telling the citizens what is good practice and what's not, because all these bits of paper are just given to the same type of people. So it's not increasing the understanding of what might be a good example of lighting or not, because it all stays in the world of people who are lighting designers, and it's only about marketing and branding. So I think it's a difficult one because awards 30 years ago were very important. And if you had, for example, a magazine about your work in Domus, it would change your life. Today, every designer has got inches of publicity in all kinds of magazines. It doesn't mean anything because those magazines are only read by other professionals. And it's not changing people's mindsets. So I don't think awards for best practice are working anymore. You need to find some other way.
А по поводу государственного регулирования...
And as for the government regulation, that's what we are going to discuss later, and Peter will be part of this roundtable. So we'll go back to the government regulation issue.
Just one question, please. Peter, I'm very glad to see you here in Moscow, and I wonder, what is your favorite place or just a part of landscape in Moscow, and why?
I, for example, like this island for the botanical gardens. And the reason for it is that if you go into botanical gardens in other cities, including Bergamo, they actually a bit dead. They like libraries with very good books, but a bit dusty, and they haven't got enough money to even employ a librarian who knows where the books are. And I think this botanical garden, I think, is a very nice public laboratory, which has got very open doors. It somehow is not orthodox about only being a botanical garden, so it doesn't mind putting on a show of tulips, which is totally kitschy, and there's thousands of people. But it also will experiment in composting, and it will also experiment in making links with businesses that fund the composting and the employees come to work and so on. So it's doing all kinds of things where it's connecting with peoples of Moscow in a way which clearly gives the place the energy and also the depth. And that's the reason why we're here, because it seems the appropriate place in Moscow to have these type of conversations. And they also significantly are open to be partners to this conversation. So they're not doing it just to rent you the space. So I think for me, this place is quite special for these reasons.